A huge thank you for joining us this morning on this very nice, crisp Saturday morning here in New York City. My name is William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs at Village Preservation. Before I introduce our wonderful guests today, let me just tell you a little bit about Village Preservation. But before I do that, first also want to thank our co-sponsors this morning, the Merchants House Museum. Please make sure to visit merchantshouse.org, learn more about this awesome place here in New York and how you can support them as well and all of their wonderful programming. But now, if you have not heard of Village Preservation before, we were founded in 1980, and we work to preserve, celebrate, and document the special architectural, cultural, and historic heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've helped secure landmark designation for more than 1,300 buildings, and we host more than 80 free programs like this throughout the year. Virtual, in-person, webinars, walking tours, exhibition tours, you name it. But we are a member-based organization, so we always need the support of folks like you. If you are interested in donating or considering becoming a member, you can go ahead and scan that QR code that you see on your screen there. But if you first would just like to find out a little bit more about the work that we do, head over to villagepreservation.org, learn more about the advocacy work that we do, the rest of our great programming that we have on. And I also highly recommend please take a look at our free digital resources. These are free for you to use whether you decide to become a member or not. Everything from an incredible image archive of pictures donated by our supporters, covering several decades of history across our neighborhoods, but I also highly recommend that you do take a look at our virtual maps as well. Put yourself together a walking tour if you're sitting right at your computer, or if you're here in New York and you want to actually pound the pavement, learn a little bit more about the incredible buildings and people that lived and worked in our neighborhoods. Now, just for some upcoming programs here in October, on Monday, October 27th, this is an in-person programming. We're having a special plaque unveiling to honor Amelia Earhart. And then on Tuesday, the 28th of October, where this is a webinar program, virtual, The Sounds of the Village, a conversation with Richard Barone. Richard Barone is a great musician and has a long, incredible history here in Greenwich Village. He's one of our most recent subjects of our oral histories, and that is another resource you are more than welcome to check out on our website as well to hear the voices of people who have lived and worked in the neighborhood over recent decades. We had started an oral history project about 10 years ago. But now it is my great privilege to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Christina Ziegler-McPherson. She has a PhD in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and focuses on the history of migration, immigrant communities, assimilation, pluralism theory, and maritime history. She's the author of 4 books and several articles and has curated several museum exhibitions dealing with migration history. She was awarded the Fulbright Senior Scholar Fellowship to Germany in 2014 and was visiting scholar at the German Maritime Museum, Leibniz Institute for Maritime History in 2016. She's a native of California and lived in Hoboken from 2005 to 2014 and has lived in Bremen, Germany since 2017. So I will now hand it over to you, Christina. I will vanish into the shadows, but I am here if you need me.
Okay, so now I have to deal with this technology. Let me share my screen. Thank you so much for this invitation and the opportunity to talk about my work. Okay, so now I need to do presentation mode. Is this working? No, we are not yet in presentation mode. Here we are in presentation mode. Okay. Can people hear me? I hope. You're all in the chat, which I'm not looking at. Um, so I hope you can see my screen.
They say yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again so much. I know I have a couple friends who are online with us, so thank you so much for taking time out of your morning. And thank you, all the rest of you, for signing in. So, what I'm going to talk about is first how Kleindeutschland, the Little Germany, developed as an immigrant community in New York, how it evolved over about 100 years. And then I'm going to talk about how the history of this community can help us better understand the concepts of assimilation, pluralism, and national identity. And then we will have questions. And so I'm looking forward to that. Okay, so next slide. And really, very briefly, something about me. This kind of sums up my career in recent years. And this is then an outline of the book. So let's get really going though. So this is a map that then shows you the major sources of German immigration in the 19th century. So there were three periods of large-scale immigration from German-speaking states to the US in the 19th century. The first was roughly from about 1830 to 1860, the second from about 1865 to 1880, and the third from 1880 to approximately 1920. In total, nearly 5.5 million Germans emigrated to the US between 1830 and 1920. And this first immigration of Germans in the 19th century started in the 1830s in reaction to economic problems in agriculture, especially rising land prices in the Rhineland. The first wave of industrialization, which started in the textile industry, also devalued traditional skills and caused people to emigrate. About 1.5 million people emigrated in this period, most of them in the 1840s and 1850s, in reaction to a series of disasters that strike Western and Central Europe. There are crop failures, there's potato rot, so the potato fungus that causes the great famine migration from Ireland also affects Western Europe. There is political revolution, and then when that fails, repression. There are strikes, and there is even famine in some regions. Most of the immigrants in this first large wave came from Baden and Württemberg in the southwest, and large numbers also came from areas along the Rhine River, Hesse, and Western Hanover. And the reason why these Germans emigrated to the US versus, say, South America or other places was that since the 17th century, there had been a history of German emigration to North America, especially from the Rhineland. Europeans who could access Western ports could then travel on existing trade routes between Europe and North America that had been established mostly by the British, but also by Dutch and French colonizers before the American Revolution. There has also been a brief but large surge in migration by Rhineland Germans in 1817 after the Tambora, Indonesia volcano eruption in 1815 and the subsequent so-called year without a summer in 1816, which caused significant economic hardship in Western Europe. So this migration in the 1830s to 1850s was by sailing ship and was mainly from French ports, particularly the Havre, also Cherbourg, and from Bremen. And the sailing ship journey across the Atlantic lasted anywhere between 6 to 12 weeks. So the reason why these Germans emigrated versus people from other parts of Europe is that the Rhine and then other German rivers gave Western Germans access to Atlantic Ocean ports and eventually Bremen and Hamburg, which are on the Weser and the Elbe rivers, respectively. And there was significant trade between these ports and the US. So there were ships making the transatlantic journey that could transport immigrants. Excuse me. So the second period of mass German immigration, which was nearly 1.5 million people, came from Prussia, Northern Hanover, Mecklenburg, and Bavaria in the 1860s and 1870s, although Rhineland immigration continued to be high in this period. And many of these people migrated because of economic displacement due to industrialization. Many of these people left from Bremen and Hamburg and traveled by passenger steamship because by this point, German steamship companies sailed regularly to the US on fixed schedules, and river steamships and railroads made it increasingly easy and cheap for people to get to ports from which to sail. The journey by steamship took between 7 to 14 days, depending on the number of ports the ship visited before its final destination. And then the third period of mass German immigration involved about 2.5 million people. This is in the late 19th century, especially in the 1880s. Most of these immigrants came from Prussia, Bavaria, and Baden-Württemberg. And like the previous wave, these people migrated for economic reasons, mostly industrial displacement and deskilling, and traveled by steamship. So the first thing to know about the German community in New York was it was diverse in terms of generation or time of immigration, as well as state of origin. So let's see if I can move my, is this going to move? Yes. So this shows the origin of German New Yorkers and how it changed over time. You can see this red block, which gets bigger, is for Prussia. And then the blue is Württemberg, the orange is Baden, the purple is Bavaria. You can see it shrinks, but keep in mind there are still large numbers of people coming from these regions. It's just the overall migration is growing also. So most of the people who came to the US from what becomes Germany between 1830 and 1920 did not settle in New York City. They traveled to many other parts of the US, especially to Midwestern states and territories. But the German migration to New York reflected the broader trends of migration to the US. The first Germans in the city were from the Rhineland, the West, and the South. So Hesse, Baden-Württemberg, Rhineland-Pfalz. In the 1860s and 1870s, German New Yorkers were more likely to be from Western Prussia and other northern states. Kleindeutschland, Little Germany, on the Lower East Side in East Greenwich Village, was the first ethnic enclave in the US. And by this, I mean a geographically distinct and identifiable area based on ethnicity. When you entered the neighborhood, you immediately recognized you were in a different part of the city. Store signs were not in English, people spoke languages other than English, and there were different social and cultural institutions than in English-speaking parts of the city. The presence of German-born architects and building contractors also meant that certain parts of the neighborhood increasingly reflected continental European architectural styles in both churches as well as secular buildings, especially after the Civil War. This German community developed rapidly after it was first established really in the 1830s. It grows significantly over the next 50 years. In 1880, there were nearly 550,000 German immigrants and their American-born children in the city, which was about 46% of the city's 1.2 million residents. In 1910, New York City had approximately 725,000 Germans and German Americans, which was about 19% of the city's 4.7 million residents. Even though many immigrants from many other countries arrived in New York in the early 20th century, Germans were still the second largest ethnic group in New York City in 1910 after Russian Jews. By the 1870s, Kleindeutschland was equivalent to being the third largest German-speaking city in the world after Berlin and Vienna. What am I talking about? So Kleindeutschland was geographically defined as the 10th, 11th, 13th, and 17th wards on the Lower East Side of Manhattan Island below East 14th Street. This neighborhood was already partly developed as a mixed residential and industrial area in the 1830s, although much of the 17th ward then was countryside, and many German immigrants who settled there built the first housing and workshops in that district. I'm sure you are all familiar, of course, with this building. This is the Tenement House Museum at 97 Orchard Street. And this is an excellent example of the housing that German immigrants built and lived in. So the residents of Kleindeutschland lived in 5 or 6-story brownstone tenement buildings made of brick with workshops in the basement, stores, saloons, restaurants on ground floors, and typically 40 apartments upstairs, 8 apartments per floor. Extended families, such as siblings, cousins, or in-laws, often rented adjacent apartments in the same building. Homework, meaning working at home, particularly garment making and cigar making, was very common. Many German immigrants were young and single and created their families in New York versus immigrating as family groups. One of the things that distinguished Kleindeutschland from other neighborhoods in the city was a high degree of self-segregation, or what we call voluntary avoidance and clustering. In other words, Germans preferred to live among other Germans, and ideally with people from the same German state. In particular, Northern Germans disliked living near Southern Germans, and when I talk about Kleindeutschland to German audiences, they all laugh because this is still completely true. At the same time, all Germans, regardless of where they came from, avoided living near Irish immigrants. Prussians concentrated in the 10th ward, and by 1880, half of the ward's population was from Prussian states. Bavarians, Badeners, and Württembergers predominated in the other three wards, so the 11th, the 13th, and the 17th. Hessians concentrated in the 13th ward. The preference for self-segregation, not surprisingly, extended to marriage. Very few Germans married Americans or immigrants of other ethnic backgrounds, and German immigrants tried to marry people from their home state whenever possible. The rate of endogamy, which is marriage within a group, for German New Yorkers ranged between 92 to 97%, depending on the decade, and this is very high. And this continued into the second generation or the first generation German American. But despite the name and the large concentration of German immigrants, this neighborhood was not actually homogeneous, and this is a very important point. The Lower East Side and East Village wards were between 33 to 53% German in the mid-19th century, and the high point of German concentration in the four wards together was 65% in 1875. Therefore, a lot of other ethnic groups lived in the neighborhood, although many of the people were from Western and Central Europe, especially the Netherlands, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, now the Czech Republic, and Poland. Many of these people spoke German as either their first or second language. There were also some Irish immigrants and white Anglo-Americans in the neighborhood, although these groups increasingly moved out as the number of Germans increased. And in the late 19th century, as the neighborhood continued to be diverse, as Eastern European Jews from Russian and Austrian and Hungarian empires emigrated and settled in what came to be called the Lower East Side. Most Germans emigrated for economic reasons, and the economy of Kleindeutschland was based on light manufacturing. Most of the residents of Kleindeutschland were skilled craftsmen, and the neighborhood had thousands of small workshops and eventually larger factories. This economy was more or less self-contained, and most German immigrants were self-employed, owning either their own workshop or store, or they worked for other Germans. The most common occupations for German immigrants in the mid-19th century were tailors, shoe and boot makers, cabinet makers, furniture upholsterers, bakers, cigar makers, butchers, brewers, and carpenters. In 1850, 46% of German immigrants worked as either tailors, shoemakers, bakers, or furniture makers. German immigrants working in business tended to be grocers, saloon keepers, or peddlers. By 1880, half of male German immigrants worked in manufacturing as skilled craftsmen. A very tiny professional elite existed in Kleindeutschland and was comprised mostly of political refugees from the 1848 revolutions. These people were lawyers, journalists, teachers, also doctors and ministers who served the community but found it difficult to move beyond the neighborhood because of language barriers or the lack of professional networks. Gradually, an elite of immigrant entrepreneurs developed over time, but this group was very small. Some of the most successful of these men were piano manufacturer Heinrich Steinweg, so Henry Steinway, the brewers Max Schaefer, Henry Clausen, George Ehret, and Jacob Rupert, rubber tire manufacturer Konrad Puppenhausen, mining magnate Meyer Guggenheim, retail entrepreneurs Nathan Oscar and Isidor Strauss, and scientific tool manufacturers Wilhelm Keufel and Hermann Esser. This is the K&E building on Fulton Street, which is quite beautiful and still exists. So Germans who wanted to do business outside of Kleindeutschland found that they needed to integrate into the larger English-speaking city in order to grow their businesses and get new customers. These merchants and ambitious craftsmen were the first to move out of the neighborhood and interact economically and socially with English-speaking New Yorkers. But many of these businessmen also saw themselves as leaders of the German community, and they were active in institutions and organizations that promoted and sustained German immigrant culture in New York. So this is Steinway. I find that Henry Steinway and his family are really excellent examples of this. The Steinways sold high-end luxury model pianos to wealthy New Yorkers who could afford them. These people were English speakers. This means the Steinways needed to have the English language and cultural fluency to do business with these customers. Thus, there was on one hand economic integration and sometimes residential and social integration as more successful German immigrants moved out of Kleindeutschland into English-speaking American neighborhoods. But on the other hand, many of these men continued to think of themselves as Bavarian or Prussian, etc. What was distinctive about Kleindeutschland when compared to other immigrant communities in New York is the wide range of institutions found in the neighborhood. Schools, libraries, churches, social clubs, labor organizations, and business associations. All three major religions, so Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism, were represented, but Catholics made up the majority of German immigrants in New York. So the immigrant community, the German immigrant community, was diverse in terms of religion, something that you did not see as much with other immigrant groups such as the Irish or later Italians. So this is the German Catholic Church, St. Nicholas, on East 2nd Street. So this church was built in 1833 because German Catholics did not want to attend services at an Irish-dominated church. They wanted German-speaking priests from their regions in Germany. But it was so difficult for Bavarian and Rhineland Catholics to get priests from their specific regions, and so it was not possible for them to have region-specific parishes, so i.e. a Bavarian parish. So Catholics from different German states formed German parishes, where language versus state of origin was a unifying factor. Among German-speaking Protestants, the majority were Lutheran, and most Lutheran churches in New York were German-speaking congregations. German Jews were divided into Orthodox and Reform congregations, and Jewish Germans brought Reform Judaism to New York. But possibly up to half of German New Yorkers did not attend a church or synagogue regularly. For these Germans, the key institution in their lives and their community were Vereine, or clubs or associations. Vereine were organized on the basis of German state of origin, socioeconomic class, religion, and time of immigration, which resulted in a wide range of organizations that reflected the diversity of the community. So there were several different kinds of Vereine. First, there were Vereine that reflect aspects of the culture that immigrants brought with them. These include music Vereine, particularly choirs, but also bands and orchestras, shooting clubs, the Schützenvereine, and the Turnverein, which is the Turner Gymnastics Club, which still exists. The second type of Verein were those that immigrants developed in reaction to their new lives in the United States. These included mutual benefit societies, so Unterstützungsvereine, homeland societies, Landsmannschaften, and labor unions, Arbeitergewerkschaften. Kulturvereine, such as singing societies and choirs, were enormously popular and were often an extension of a craft labor union or a homeland society. These groups were important expressions of immigrants' cultures and helped immigrants maintain a feeling of connection to their homelands. By 1880, New York had 64 musical societies, most of them German and located on the Lower East Side. Among the many singing societies, some of the most prominent were the Deutsche Liederkranz, which still exists and was founded in 1847, the Rheinischer Sängerbund, which was also founded in 1847, the Gesangverein Schillerbund, which was founded in 1850, and the German Jewish Gesellschaft Harmony, which was founded in 1852, also still exists, and Ariam, which was founded in 1854. Some of these singing societies, such as the Liederkranz, also had children's choirs and women's choirs, so the entire family could participate, and hired professional choir directors and accompanists. One of the most important social events on the calendar of the neighborhood was the annual Sängerfest, singing festival in the summer, which was usually held in July and took place over several days. These musical festivals featured thousands of participants and were attended by hundreds of thousands of people. There were also special events, such as the benefit concerts the Rheinischer Sängerbund gave to raise money for the relief of widows and orphans of German soldiers who were killed in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71, or the concerts given when Prince Henry of Prussia visited New York in 1902. By 1880, Kleindeutschland's largest Gesangverein had moved out of the bars and rented halls into their own clubhouses and performance spaces. The most prestigious of the singing societies, which were the Liederkranz and Arion, had clubhouses at 3135 East 4th Street and 1921 St. Mark's Place, respectively. These spaces featured rooms for rehearsals, large concerts, and socializing. And several of these clubhouses still exist and are historical landmarks. So this is the clubhouse of the Aryan Society in St. Mark's. And this is the Aschenbrodel building on East 4th Street, which Aschenbrodel was a union for musicians. And they built this clubhouse for themselves. So these choirs became vehicles for the upwardly mobile to network. The larger men's choirs charge an initiation fee and an annual membership fee, with singers paying a smaller fee and more passive members paying a higher fee to attend concerts and other social events. The ability to pay such membership dues increasingly defined these organizations as elite clubs. The membership fee of the Liederkranz, which was sponsored by the Steinway Piano Company, was $5 per year in 1859, but $20 in 1877. This is about $400 in today's dollars. And the society then had about 1,500 members in 1880, and most of them were passive members. Many prominent or aspiring politicians joined the Liederkranz and the Aryan Society to network. So, for example, Theodore Roosevelt was a member of the Liederkranz, although he, of course, is not German or German American. The leading promoter of Musikvereine in Kleindeutschland was the Steinway Piano Company, which opened its Steinway Hall, which was a combination showroom and recital hall, at 109 East 14th Street in 1866. And here, company president William Steinway hosted concerts featuring, of course, Steinway pianos. Between the 1850s and World War I, New York had 5 different German theaters. Most of them were located on the Lower East Side. So you have the Das Alte Stadttheater, which was built in 1854, das Neue Stadttheater, which was built in 1864, Neuendorfs Germania Theater, built in 1872, das Thalia Theater, built in 1879, and das Irving Place Theater, which was built in 1888. And these theaters presented a mixture of traditional German drama written by classical playwrights like Goethe and Schiller, as well as traditional farce, folk plays, music theater, operettas, and opera. For 6 seasons between 1884 and 1890, all the opera performed at the Metropolitan Opera was in German, under the direction of conductors Leopold Damrosch and Anton Seidel. So this is an interesting image of German society from Harper's. I enjoy looking at these old images, particularly from the English press, because it's a type of anthropological view of the community. This is actually from a British paper doing an anthropological study of Kleindeutschland. So New York had more than 800 beer gardens in the 19th century. Several were on the Lower East Side. There was the Deutsches Volksgarten, which was at 199 Bowery. The Atlantic Gardens, which was across the street at 50 Bowery. This was at one time the largest restaurant in the country. It had seating for 1,400. The National Garden, which was at 104 Bowery. The Pacific Garden at 54 Bowery, and the Tivoli Garden at 19 St. Mark's Place. Unlike the traditional Anglo-American saloon or bar, which was for men only and only tolerated women as prostitutes, the beer garden was recognized by German immigrants to be a family-friendly environment, and a visit to the beer garden in the afternoon or Sundays, or evening, was a common way for German families to spend Sundays. And this issue of drinking alcohol and socializing in beer gardens was a major cultural point of tension with particularly Anglo-Americans who objected to the sale of alcohol on Sundays. So this is the Schützengesellschaft, the shooting club at St. Mark's. Shooting clubs were another German import that matched the American tradition of militias, which were very popular in the antebellum period. These clubs developed into middle-class organizations by the 1880s. The Deutsche Amerikanische Schützengesellschaft had 1,400 members organized into 24 companies by the 1880s. And at their clubhouse here, which I think is a particularly beautiful building, members could socialize, engage in target practice, and they raised funds to travel to Germany to participate in international shooting contests. This is the Turnverein, the Turner Gymnastics Society clubhouse on East 4th Street. So when the Turnverein first appeared in New York in 1850, its members' gymnastics displays and parades through the streets caused much comment among the English language press in the city. But by the late 19th century, the Turnverein was well established. There was a large turn hall here on East 4th Street that featured bowling alleys in the basement, a restaurant on the ground floor, meetings rooms, classrooms, locker rooms, rooms for dancing and fencing on the first floor, ballroom and stage on the second floor, and the gymnasium, finally, on the third floor. The turn hall's multifunctional space made it a very central meeting place for a variety of Vereine in Kleindeutschland, and the hall hosted many different types of social gatherings, ranging from wedding receptions to labor strike meetings. This is the Oddfellows Hall on St. Mark's Place. Fraternal orders were very popular among men in the US and in Europe. German New Yorkers had had a Masonic lodge since 1819, and by the 1870s, there were 18 German Masonic lodges in New York. 17 of them were affiliated with lodges in Prussia and one with Hamburg. There were also German-speaking lodges of American fraternal orders, such as the Oddfellows, Foresters, Druids, and Redmen, as well as fraternal orders created by German immigrants, called the Harigari, Hermann's Söhne, Hermann's Sons, the Vereinte Deutsche Brüder, United German Brothers, the Templars, the Freiheitssöhne, Freedom's Sons, B'nai B'rith, and the Free Sons of Israel. So this is Concordia Hall, and this is Scheffel Hall, and this is the Social Reform Hall. And what I like about this photo is you can see the Chinese characters of the store now downstairs. So sick and death benefit societies, the Unterstützungsvereine, were the most common type of Vereine in Kleindeutschland, followed by homeland societies. Unterstützungsvereine were developed as mutual aid and sick and burial societies by and for mostly working class immigrants who could no longer depend on traditional forms of support in Europe and who were living in a foreign country that provided little to no social safety net in the case of illness, accident, or sudden death. For a small monthly payment, so between 12 to 25 cents, members received financial assistance if they became sick or disabled, and the Verein helped pay for a funeral if a member died. Most mutual aid societies were organized around particular occupations and performed similar functions as trade unions in the 1850s. But in the 1860s, more and more mutual aid societies became organized on the basis of homeland origin because immigrants found it easier to trust funds to a fellow immigrant from the same state or region versus a stranger who held the same kind of job. Homeland societies grouped people according to German state of origin, and in addition to providing social welfare support in the times of illness, injury, and death, homeland societies organized regular meetings, dances, and picnics to celebrate the history and culture of the regions from which their members had emigrated. By the 1850s, some of the Landsmannschaften festivals were attracting tens of thousands of participants. Immigrants from Württemberg were the first to organize a confederation of Vereine in 1862 to organize a regional folk fest to celebrate the culture of their homeland. By 1880, the Bavarians and the Plattdeutsch, which is northwest Germany, had also followed this practice of organizing confederation. And these festivals became major events on the community's social calendar. The first Plattdeutsch Folkfest in 1875, for instance, attracted 150,000 people. And this is a period when New York had about 1 million people, so approximately 10% of the city's population attended this one event. German immigrants also organized labor unions, which ranged in philosophy from mainstream craft union to socialist, Marxist, and anarchist, as workers confronted the same pressures from industrialization as they had in Europe. German labor unions were at the forefront of the 10-hour and then the 8-hour day movement in the US in the late 19th century. And German unions participated in the first Labor Day held in September 1882 in the city. Other important institutions that German immigrants established for their community were a hospital, a reference library, a savings bank, a legal aid society, a orphan asylum, and the German Society for Widows and Orphans. So this is the German dispensary, which becomes the Lenox Avenue Hospital. And this is the German branch of the Y. And this is a charming image from Harper's of Thompson Square Park in the village. So beginning in the 1880s, during the third period of mass immigration, German immigrants began settling in Yorkville in Upper East Manhattan between 83rd and 89th Streets and between First Avenue and the new Central Park. A large number of German immigrants also settled in the Bronx, which was increasingly accessible by the new subway after 1904. German immigrants and German Americans moved out of the Lower East Side and the East Village because opportunities for new and better housing uptown were developing as the city grew. The Lower East Side especially had been very crowded for a long time, and the growth of heavier industry made the area less desirable to live in. As Germans moved uptown, they also moved their businesses, vereine, beer gardens, theaters, churches, and synagogues with them. Many German Americans became the landlords of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who transferred the Lower East Side from a German area to a Jewish one beginning in the 1890s. The Upper East Side and the Bronx were soon populated with German businesses and social and cultural institutions in the early 20th century, as the Lower East Side had been before and after the Civil War. Excuse me. So I'd like to briefly talk about the Slocum, the General Slocum accident. And there aren't that many images of this, for better or for worse. These are some newspaper headlines. Let me this here. So on June 15th, 1904, 1,021 members of St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church died when the leisure paddle boat, the General Slocum, caught fire and ran aground on Brothers Island in the East River while on its way to a church picnic on Long Island. Although largely forgotten today, the General Slocum accident was the largest loss of life in New York City until September 11th, 2001. Most New Yorkers know little to nothing about the Slocum accident. What is known is the persistent and false claim that the Slocum accident destroyed Kleindeutschland. The Germans left the Lower East Side for Yorkville and the Bronx, either out of grief and or a desire to be closer to the spot where the Slocum sank. The original source of this argument was the observation by the city's Department of Public Charities that 170 or 28% of the city, that 170 or 28% of the 622 families known to have been on the Slocum had moved out of the Lower East Side by 1905. Another source for this idea came from the press. The New York Times wrote on June 26, 1904, 11 days after the accident, quote, "Nor will the church be the only sufferer. What has been such a dire blow to its life will be a blow to the neighborhood of which it was the center, Little Germany, as it is called affectionately by the people who live in it. The exodus of the dead to the Lutheran cemetery will be followed by an exodus of the living to other parts of the city and new surroundings, where they can forget the dark days and the tragic scenes enacted during the last weeks in a quarter they were wont to treasure as the nearest reproduction to Die Alte Heimat on American soil. With them, the festive song and story of the Liedertafel and the pomp of the Schützenbund will disappear also. And the district, which has maintained its characteristics for over half a century, longer than any other part of the city, will have lost its identity and be given over to the overflow from the Lower East Side. I will bury my dear ones that are dead from their old home, said a businessman who lost his wife and children on the excursion. Then I will take a last look at the church, bid goodbye to good Pastor Haas, and turn my back on this part of town forever. So the supposed exodus and the myth of community destruction are actually completely false. When the Slocum burned, Germans' abandonment of the Lower East Side was largely complete. Yorkville had become the new geographic center of Kleindeutschland, but New York's German community had always been more than simply a geographic location, but rather a community defined and grounded by its institutions. By 1904, German institutions in New York were mature, if not aged. In some cases, like the German Society, the Deutsche Gesellschaft, already more than 100 years old. The appeal of Vereine for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of their founders was fading. But some institutions, particularly churches, were able to hold onto their members because of the important spiritual and social functions they played in people's lives. By 1904, most New Yorkers of German heritage were the children, grandchildren, or even great-grandchildren of German immigrants who had arrived in the first large wave of German immigration in the pre-Civil War period. Others were the children or grandchildren of the second and third waves of the 1860s to 1880s. These people might still identify themselves as German and consider themselves part of the city's German community, but they were themselves far removed from the immigrant experience. A close examination of the victims and survivors of the accident indicate that the 1,350 New Yorkers who were on the General Slocum were distinctive within the larger New York German community. They were more often German-born than second or third generation German American, more often recent immigrants, having immigrated in the 1890s and early 1900s, which was a period, of relatively low German immigration. And they were more likely to stay on the Lower East Side rather than moving to Yorkville, the Bronx, or Brooklyn, despite the neighborhood's demographic changes. Rather than abandoning Kleindeutschland, the large majority of survivors and their families stayed in the old neighborhood, sometimes as late as the 1930s, and it is their persistence in the face of demographic change that is remarkable. Scholarship on the impact of violent events on communities show that tragedy and trauma can bring people in a community closer together, not break it apart, as survivors connect to others through their shared experiences and through the experience of building and preserving memory. So this is what happened with the Association of General Slocum Survivors and its efforts to keep alive the memory of the disaster and honor the dead. The ultimate failure of this memory preservation effort was due to both the rapid death rate of survivors. By 1954, only 12 survivors were still alive, and by the refusal of the larger New York City population to recognize the pain of survivors after 1915. During World War I, English language newspapers in the city refused to cover the June 15th observations of the accident, and then were slow to resume their coverage after the war. Although there have been many literary and cinematic references to the General Slocum accident, many ignore the German connections to the event. The 1934 film Manhattan Melodrama starred Clark Gable and William Powell as two men who survived the Slocum accident as boys, but were orphaned by the disaster. Yet any and all Germanness of the accident is written out of the film. Gable and Powell's characters have Irish and Anglo-American names. They are rescued by an Irish Catholic priest and ultimately adopted by a Russian Jew. In 1934, when Manhattan Melodrama was playing in New York City's theater, the city's German community was deeply divided by Nazism and the rise of the German-American Bund. But there were still 47 survivors living at the time and still insisting that the city recognize their loss and honor their dead. The General Slocum accident did not destroy Kleindeutschland or encourage the movement of Germans out of the Lower East Side. Rather, a schism developed within the church over how to deal with the dispersal of donated funds to survivors, and this fractured the congregation. The fighting within the church about what to do about the relief fund did more to cause people to leave St. Mark's and the Lower East Side than the burning of the General Socom. World War I did, however, intensify the assimilation of many German American New Yorkers and led to what I have called the Great Disappearance. I have a lot of posters from the war because I love propaganda art. Excuse me. This is particularly gorgeous. So. The association of German culture and language with militarism and autocracy resulted in the demonization of German culture from the highest levels of government and from all major American institutions. Germans had long enjoyed a great deal of social and cultural respect in American society, and they now found themselves politically socialized and sometimes also economically marginalized in favor of other groups, especially English speakers and French speakers. German citizens in the US were designated alien enemies and lived under a wide range of restrictions on their behavior. Alien enemies could not travel in certain areas, including on streetcars and subways, and were barred from being 100 yards within the waterfront and from being within 1/2 mile of a military facility, such as a military base or armory, or a business with military contracts, rules which, because of New York City's geography, significantly affected people's lives. German citizens living on both sides of the Hudson River were evicted from their homes, and many men lost their jobs either because they were German or because they could not access their place of work. Germans considered a dangerous threat to the war effort were arrested and detained, first on Ellis Island and then in a prison camp in North Carolina. Government censorship of foreign language newspapers and the requirement that all non-English language material be submitted to federal censors before publication caused all but the largest German newspapers in the US to close. New York City had 31 German language newspapers publishing before the war. Only 8 of them, 2 of them dailies, survived until the 1920s. Most churches abandoned German in favor of English in their religious services. After World War I, many German institutions continued to exist, but they had changed their names to more English-sounding ones or had adopted English as the language of business. Smaller organizations ceased to function as members drifted away, not willing to associate themselves with visibly German groups. Prohibition also closed off meeting places for many small organizations, which had traditionally met in pubs. Of the dozens of singing societies, for example, only the largest survived, such as the Liederkranz. These groups tended to have elite membership and often owned real estate in the form of large clubhouses. The Turnverein managed to survive mainly because athletics and fitness were no longer seen as German by the 19-teens. The people who continued to participate in Vereine were either older, wealthier, and used these clubs as they always had for networking, or they were German immigrants versus German Americans. German Americans continued, of course, to meet with friends and to socialize, but these gatherings were more often informal than formal, and groups no longer chose to identify themselves as German to their neighbors and the larger community through the confident taking out of a short ad in the city directory or the newspaper. There was no more parading around the streets on the way to or from a Verein party or picnic. The festivals that had attracted hundreds of thousands of attendees were over. For people seeking clearly identifiable German organizations, there were far fewer groups from which to choose. So, what can studying immigrant neighborhoods tell us about assimilation, pluralism, and segregation, and this very large question of American national identity? I hope people can read this. And I should explain, I use the word assimilation instead of integration because I define integration as one stage in assimilation, and I will explain this now. So when people are talking about assimilation, they usually are talking about culture and lifestyle. But assimilation can be measured in many different aspects of life, in politics, such as political participation and citizenship, in economics, so in terms of participating in the mainstream versus an ethnic economy, or in the presence or absence of discrimination in hiring and promotion, in society in terms of participating in social, cultural, educational institutions, residential integration, intermarriage. Assimilation can also be measured in the areas of values and identity, and in the presence or absence of prejudice, discrimination, and power conflicts between groups. So there are many different aspects of life in which people can become more or less like one another or maintain their differences. And integration is only one stage in a long, not linear, not automatic process. So very briefly, some very short summary of theory. So one way of understanding how this all works is to say that if you have a homogeneous society in which everyone is the same, and so this is what I'm calling society or group A, and then you introduce a minority group into the society, so group B, then assimilation is when group A totally absorbs group B and group B ceases to exist as an identifiable group. So A plus B equals A. In this model, society is relatively static in that the absorption of the minority group does not change the fundamental structure or nature of the larger group. A second theory says that when group A and group B merge, they form a new society, C, that is this blend of the two. So A plus B equals C. In this model, society is dynamic in that it changes as a result of the contributions from the minority group. And this idea is sometimes called the melting pot. A third theory says that when group A and group B merge, they produce a society that has a variety of new elements that are the product of the mixings of the two groups, but it retains many elements of the majority group, so group A, and a few core elements of the minority group. So aspects of each contributing group are present in the new society, but these aspects differ in degrees of strength and significance. And so studying a neighborhood like Kleindeutschland can help us understand how assimilation and cultural pluralism work in a democratic society. Kleindeutschland and other immigrant neighborhoods in American cities in the 19th century were formed by migration networks, by people's incomes and need to be close to work, and by the willingness or unwillingness of other groups to live near a particular group. In New York, ethnic clustering was as much, if not more, the result of native-born Americans refusing to live near immigrants, as it was the product of immigrants choosing to live with people like themselves. Thus, Kleindeutschland was created both by German immigrants' desire to live with other German speakers and by English-speaking Americans' withdrawal from the Lower East Side and East Village to other parts of the city, which in turn became overwhelmingly native-born. In fact, native-born neighborhoods in New York in the 19th century tended to be far more homogeneous in terms of race, ethnicity, religion, and socioeconomic class than immigrant neighborhoods were. Immigrant neighborhoods also played a role in groups' assimilation. Voluntary segregation is an immigrant group's first step toward the formation of an ethnic group and then assimilation into the larger society, although assimilation is not inevitable. The argument is that historically, most immigrants did not arrive in a new country as members of a self-identified organized ethnic group. They arrived at different points in time, from different places, and with different backgrounds, often spoke different dialects, and settled in different parts of the new country. In the 19th century, when Germany did not even exist as a nation state, regional identities were strong and long-standing, and immigrants' various biases and prejudices were reflected in where they chose to live in the neighborhood. This is why German immigrants created homeland societies, so they could live and connect with people from their homeland, which they did not define as Germany, but as their home state of origin. There were both external and internal forces that encouraged the assimilation of German speakers in New York. First, English-speaking Americans defined everyone who lived in the neighborhood, regardless of origin, as German, or sometimes Dutch, the English bastardization of Deutsch. And since English-speaking Americans were the majority and the most powerful group in the city, socially, economically, and politically, their attitudes influenced how others perceived German speakers. Secondly, through living in the neighborhood, German speakers in Kleindeutschland encountered many different people, not all of them from German-speaking countries, and these interactions caused immigrants to change their understandings of themselves. By living with other German speakers from a wide variety of German-speaking regions, these immigrants in New York developed a community based on shared language, and secondly, common cultural practices and values, and gradually developed a German identity over the course of multiple generations. So this is the first stage of assimilation, the creation of an ethnic identity in a new context out of many regional or religious identities. So Hessians, Prussians, Bavarians, etc. became German. This development of a new ethnic identity, German, was the result of immigrants and their American-born children and grandchildren deciding what aspects of their cultural heritages were essential to their identities and what could be changed and abandoned as they adapted to a new social environment. For Germans, what was essential to their identity and to their community's distinctiveness was first and foremost language, which came to be understood as High German in writing and in education. Secondly, living a German lifestyle, eating, drinking, socializing with family and friends in beer gardens and parks, especially on Sundays. German folk music was also seen as being very important to this type of recreation. Being a member of a or several Vereine, be they homeland societies, labor unions, mutual aid societies, or choirs, was also central to this German ethnic identity. German immigrants both assimilated in terms of shedding regional identities and forming a new German community, and they also assimilated into the larger English-speaking American society through their adoption of American citizenship and American political values. So when German immigrant Americans voted against politicians and laws that sought to restrict drinking and alcohol sales on Sunday, they were using American participatory democracy to defend their values. Or when Germans got themselves elected to the local city council or school board to promote bilingual education, this was local democracy in action. These immigrant groups were living certain primary American political values, such as participatory democracy, majority rule, political negotiation, and compromise, when they organized to protect what they perceived as their community's interests, and they did so as naturalized American citizens. So you can see immigrants organizing themselves as an interest group as a form of pluralism, but you can also view it as an example of assimilation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, German-speaking intellectuals and political activists began organizing lobbying groups to promote what they defined as German culture and to protect what they considered to be particularly German interests, mainly the teaching of the German language in schools and the opposition to alcohol prohibition. These cultural activists began arguing for a pluralistic understanding of American society in which the preservation of the ethnic group and its language, culture, and institutional structure was defined as a social benefit and thus should be promoted. These German Americans asserted that to be a true American, one had to exemplify American ideals, especially the idea of liberty. To be an American was a state of doing, not of being. And the best way to express one's freedom as an American was to be true to one's ethnic heritage. For these German American activists, being a good German meant being a good German, speaking good German, being active in German social cultural groups, displaying the positive characteristics of German culture to other groups. Yet, as the historian John Hyam noted about such activists, quote, cultural pluralism would appeal to people who were already strongly enough positioned to imagine that permanent minority status might be advantageous. It was congenial to minority spokesmen confident enough to visualize themselves at the center rather than the periphery of the American experience. Accordingly, cultural pluralism proved most attractive to people who who were already largely assimilated. It was itself one of the products of the American melting pot. For most of the 19th century, it had been possible for German immigrants to live a German life in Kleindeutschland, but this life had always been narrow and limited. Kleindeutschland had always been more ethnically and linguistically diverse and less German than it appeared to outsiders, and any shopkeeper or entrepreneur who wanted to do business outside of a German-only speaking customer base had to learn at least some English. Although Germans were a large minority in the city, they were still a minority, and they were never able to control the public or Catholic parochial school systems as they did in some other cities. Despite the brief introduction of German as a second language in the city schools in the 1870s, this meant that German American children were educated primarily, if not exclusively, in the English language. This meant that the preservation of German required active effort on the part of both parents and children. Germans' political divisions also meant they were not able to dominate either of the main two political parties, as Irish Americans came to do with the Democratic Party in the city. For nearly 100 years, Germans and German Americans had defined the German language and participating in organized social cultural activities with other Germans as being intrinsic to their identity as German. In the words of the sociologist Milton Gordon, these activities were, quote, essential and vital ingredients of the group's cultural heritage and derive exactly from that heritage. But by the 1920s, it was clear that these socio-cultural activities were actually what Gordon defined as extrinsic, or, quote, products of the historical vicissitudes of a group's adjustment to its local environment, that are external to the core of the group's ethnic cultural heritage. World War I caused German New Yorkers to question and reflect upon what was actually essential to their community. If the German language and Verein culture were no longer central to being German, then what exactly distinguished them from other white Northern European ethnic groups in American society? Although German New Yorkers pretended that language and Verein culture were not actually essential to being German, they were, in fact, what had distinguished Germans as an ethnic group from the city's many other immigrant groups. Geography, the tight density of Kleindeutschland as a German neighborhood, had also been underappreciated by German immigrants and German Americans as a glue that held their community together. American society continued to be dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants for most of the 20th century, and American culture still retains many powerful elements of the US's English and British heritages. The dominance of the English language, English common law tradition, puritanical morality, individualism, litigiousness, proclivity toward conspiracy theorizing and witch hunting, and so on. But the American society and culture that Germans assimilated into by the 1930s had itself been profoundly shaped by 100 years of German immigration. In the case of German immigrants, assimilation did not mean absorption into a static, unchanging American culture dominated by white, English-speaking Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Rather, this assimilation was a product and a process of creating a new society and culture through interactions of English speakers and German speakers, with each ethnic group becoming more like one another and in turn changing the larger society's understanding of what it was to be an American. German immigrants introduced new foods. Of course, we're all familiar with lager beer, hot dogs, and so on. New forms of recreation, new educational methods and systems, particularly the kindergarten, the high school, the research university, and physical and vocational education. Our many different holiday traditions, ranging from the Christmas tree and Santa Claus to Advent calendars and the Easter Bunny. New forms of social and labor organization. The concept of the weekend as a time of leisure and personal free time versus church attendance and Bible reading was a product of the German-dominated labor movement and its campaign for an 8-hour day beginning in the 1880s. As Germans assimilated into American society, they changed that society through the force of their numbers and the attractiveness of their cultural practices. Thus, Kleindeutschland and the New York City German community can be seen as a rare example of an actual melting pot. And I would like to conclude here with one of my favorite images of some of these ideas. This is from 1888 from the Judge magazine, and the title is Uncle Sam is a Man of Strong Features. And I'm not sure if you can see, but it's on my left, which I think is on your right. At the forehead, there are two fat, very satisfied looking gentlemen, and my left is a German, and on the other side is supposedly the Englishman. And so I like to use this image when I do teacher training programs dealing with the concept of the melting pot, and to ask the question, is this an example of assimilation or of pluralism? So thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to your questions. As I think, how do we say it? Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to not talking so much. And let's see, how do I get out of this? I need to stop sharing. Okay, sorry.
Right. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. All right. So, folks, if you do have questions, we have about 10 minutes time for some
Oh,
questions
I'm
or
so sorry
so.
I talked so much.
No, it was absolutely fascinating. I think we all learned so incredibly much. So, we really appreciate you putting this together. Yeah, someone said awesome. Thank you. But we do have some questions. First one is someone is asking about your background and the trunks in the background. If you could just briefly explain your
Oh,
background.
so this is a photo from the German Maritime Museum, one of the buildings in the Maritime Museum. This building actually has been closed for several years for renovation, and I just have always liked it. It's just a collection of old, I think, North German Lloyd travel plaques, and so I just like to use it as a background.
So then we have one question here. With the Germans living in Kleindeutschland, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, are there any stories about anti-Semitism from Christian Germans to Jewish Germans in the neighborhood?
Yes, I talk about this quite a bit in the book. Um, Initially, there really doesn't seem to be any kinds of issues of anti-Semitism, but in the early 1880s, there starts to be clear examples of anti-Semitism, particularly in the more elite Vereine. There is a controversy in particular in the Liederkranz about admitting Jewish members, because the Liederkranz was one of these organizations where to join you needed to be sponsored by a member. And so there started to be literally blackballing of Jews, and there was this big discussion about, I'm trying to remember who, about Jacob Schiff, I think was a member, and these Jews, well, we can let Schiff in, but then we're not going to allow other Jews. So there definitely starts to be anti-Semitism, and interestingly, it's at very much an elite level, as wealthier German immigrants, German Americans start expressing anti-Semitic views against other members of their community. There's also, I can't remember exactly when, there's a very famous incident um, of discrimination at a hotel in the Hudson River Valley. I can't remember exactly, but there is definitely anti-Semitism very much becomes an issue. Um, and it then encourages the development of really a more separate Jewish community, because until you have the large migration of Eastern European Jews, basically almost all Jewish New Yorkers are of German background. There are very, very few Sephardic um, Jews in the city. So this prejudice very much encourages Jewish German New Yorkers to increasingly to identify themselves as Jewish and not as German. Sorry, excuse me. That's
No, no, fascinating. And then we have another question. Through the 19th century, what were some of the costs of for the Germans to immigrate from the early 19th century to the latter part of the 19th century? How much did it cost to sail across the Atlantic and immigrate?
okay. Uh, okay, that's a very difficult question. And I can't give you a very specific answer. I am because that's something I need to look it up depending on a certain time, which port you're traveling from. Basically, the cost to travel goes down significantly as first sailing ships sail more regularly, so you're not spending so much time in port waiting. This causes the ticket price to drop as you actually get a travel industry that is facilitating migration. This also drives the cost down. The steamship tickets become increasingly cheap as you can get across the Atlantic faster and faster. There is a whole system of prepaid tickets where a person can buy a ticket in the United States and basically have it sent or as a credit to someone in Europe. And so this then enables people to travel, to migrate also. Um, See, my temptation is to give like a very broad thing, like, a percentage of a person's annual income. And I don't feel like I should do that. Basically, it becomes a lot cheaper. That's a very crude summary. Sorry. But um, I can, I will have to look up some literature and I can pass it on to Mr. Roca and then he can, I don't know what, share it. Because there is some very interesting information about how much it costs, but I don't have that right in front of me.
Of course, it's a very complicated question. Another question here is, New York remains, a city of different ethnic enclaves, racial enclaves. In 19th century New York, did any other immigrant groups kind of segregate or associate themselves by points of origin, like, regions of those home countries in the same way that the Germans did?
Um, well, you have the Irish community um, that Irish immigrants are immigrating basically in the same time period in large numbers. And you do obviously have immigrants from a number of places in Europe, but the largest groups in the US and in the city are from German-speaking states and from Ireland. So yes, the Irish create their own neighborhoods. Um, the Irish immigration is complicated by the fact that the vast majority of them are Roman Catholic, and so where people settle is often tied to parishes because people want to be close to churches. So that is something that's a little different. And I don't know that much about the Irish community in New York, I have to say. But yes, the Germans are not the only ones who create communities.
And for folks asking, the program has been recorded and it will be shared afterwards to everyone that registered. Another question I have is, as you were talking about how German identity was being formed within Kleindeutschland and how they thought of themselves vis-a-vis being American, did did any of that thinking influence identity formation or how German identity was being looked at back in Europe? If any of those people went back as visitors or as a return migrant?
Um, so the thing that's interesting when you look at the development of an immigrant ethnic identity is, so when a person emigrates, she brings her culture with them, and it's tied to the moment when they left their home country. And so then they have to adapt to life in a new society. Um, and at the same time, though, the culture in the society that they left is continuing to develop on its own track. So you can think of it as two separate tracks. Um, the thing that's interesting with um, immigration in the 19th century is because of the steamship and the ability to go across the Atlantic relatively quickly. By the late 19th century, it is possible for German Americans to go back to Europe to experience then German society as it is evolving on its own cultural evolutionary track. And so there is some, interesting interactions between German Americans who go to Europe. There are German Americans and particularly German immigrants who go back to Europe for vacation or for business. So they maintain connections. Um, I don't, I haven't done as much research as I probably should have about these interactions, about who's quote more German than not. But it is definitely German German immigrants become their own German thing in America. It truly becomes German American. It's it's distinctly different from Germans in Germany. Um, and those interactions would be very interesting. Um, but for the most part, most Germans who emigrated, they stay in the US. They don't go to Germany regularly. So um, sorry, that's a very convoluted response.
It's a
So-
big, big topic. All right, I think for maybe a couple more questions. Did the British use of the Hessian soldiers during the Revolutionary War, did that in any way help precipitate mass migration of Germans as we entered the 19th century?
No. Okay. So the Hessians, they are an important group in the very late colonial, early republic period, because a lot of these soldiers who survived the revolution, um, some of them do decide to stay. But there is this period where you don't have a lot of migration after the American Revolution, mostly because the Napoleonic Wars really militarized the Atlantic. And so there really is not a lot of trade between the new United States and parts of Europe. Um, there isn't trade with other parts of Europe during the Revolution. um, and it's only after the Napoleonic Wars end in 1815 that you then have a resumption of migration from Europe. And so you first have this big blip of about 10,000 people in 1817 after the volcano causes this climate event. And then finally, after another 10 to 15 years, then you start to have more immigration. But you have this period where basically between the American Revolution and 1815, where there's very, very little migration in general. And so the Hessians are kind of their own group. They end up forming their own communities. Um, but it isn't quite like in the 19th century where a family will migrate and then write back to the rest of their family or other friends and say, yeah, life in such and such place is great. You should come. And by the way, here's some money for a ticket. That's very different.
And we have one comment, and this will be our last one here today. So someone wrote, I was surprised to learn that Germans are one of the top migrant groups to the US today, and German seems to be one of the most spoken languages beside English in parts of the Midwest. What do you know about today's German migration in the US and maybe how it compares similarly and differently to the period that you discussed today?
So I don't know that much because I don't study contemporary German immigration, but as somebody who knows something about German immigration law or immigration law, I can tell you that basically all German immigrants to the US are highly skilled because Germany is a highly skilled, industrialized country. Um, People are emigrating for jobs, particularly technology jobs, white collar jobs. They're migrating to go to school, to go to American universities, and they're migrating for marriage. They meet Americans, they fall in love, and they move to the United States. And that's basically the same thing you could say about most Europeans who emigrate to the US, is they're emigrating for work, education, and family reasons. So they're quite different in that you do not have this working class migration of people who are reacting to de-skilling due to industrialization, economic displacement, um, or even famine and crop failure, various periods. So that's what I can tell you very briefly about German immigration to the U.S. now.
Well, my mom was the last one there. My dad was a US soldier stationed in Germany, and that's where he met my mom and where I was originally born. So
Yep.
thank you so much for this fabulous presentation. I saw so many thank yous and people saying how much they enjoyed and how they really enjoyed learning so much. So all of you, I want you to wish us all a big Dankeschön to Dr. Ziegler-McPherson for this fabulous presentation. Christina, thank you so much for doing this for us today. We really, really appreciate it. Everyone else, thank you so much for tuning in this Saturday morning. We appreciate you spending your time with us here today and hope to see you at a future village preservation presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your weekends. Take
Thank
care.
you. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.